This is a slideshow on the Wellsville, Addison and Galeton Railroad. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And this is an employee timetable. They actually have an employee timetable, which I have a copy of. And here's a couple of pages. It wasn't a very large timetable. It had about 4 pages. They basically, their engine terminal and shops and headquarters was in Galeton, Pennsylvania. And they ran north to Wellsville, New York. And they ran east and then north to basically to Elkland. At one time, it went to Addison, New York. So now this will be on the screen for about a minute so you can read it.
Thank you. That's Wikipedia. You muted us, right?
Oh, I can hear people mumbling there. Rather than read this to you, I figured it's less confusing if you just look at it and read it. The operations began in 1956. So here's a map of the railroad. Again, Galeton was the headquarters and where the engine terminal and shops were. They only ran to Wellsville, New York once a week in the 1970s. And it was on a Friday. So if you wanted to chase the train up and back, you had to do it on a Friday. You had to take a day off from work. They didn't run on weekends. And a couple of the other days of the week, they either ran to Ansonia, which was their interchange with New York Central, and then later Penn Central. And then they also ran up to Elkland, and their business on that end was tanneries, animal hides. So they served one in Westfield and they served one in Elkland. Eventually, they both burned down and closed because everything's imported from China now. So we don't tan leather here in the country anymore, or at least not in Pennsylvania. So the railroad did well up until like the early 1970s, and then you could see it was starting to struggle. Let's see what we have here. In the diesel era, they started out with GE 80 tonners, or 125 tonners rather, center cabs. And then they migrated to F units, and that's probably what they were best known for, was their F units. They had a number of F units, but usually at one time they only had like 2 in service. And they ran them back to back AA, but there were times that they ran like a single unit. So obviously in one direction it'd be backwards because they didn't have a Y on the east end of the railroad where they could turn anything around. They had an engine terminal or engine house in Galeton, which burned down. So they actually built a new one, which looks more like a Butler building, and it looked kind of modern. And that was toward the end too. So surprising that they spent the money and did that. So here's a roster of what they had. As you can see, they had as many as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 F7A units and 1 B unit. The B unit never ran on the WAG. It was a parts unit. And their engines eventually went to the Louisiana and Northwest. And then 2 of them wound up in the Golden Gate Railroad Museum. And 2 of them went to the Pittsburgh area Pat train. And then they went to Condot. And I think one of them wound up on the Naugatuck Railroad. That was the 2300. So the era that I was there in 1972 and 73, the 125 or 132 ton center cabs were out of service. I did get to shoot them. They were there in the deadline, as you can see here. They had the 1500, 16, 1700, and 1800, but they were out of service. They weren't running. They were using the F units. Now these shots are taken at Galeton. different. Some of these shots are by other photographers. And I think this one was by Don Jolson. He was up there frequently. And there's the 1700. And there's that B unit back there. That never got painted for WAG. It always stayed in that Western Pacific scheme. And Galeton was a really neat place to railfan because it was the typical short line with junk and parts and garbage laying all over the place. There's the 1700 when it was going to be shipped out. And notice a 40-foot steel boxcar back there. The Wellsville, Addison and Galeton was best known for its outside braced wooden boxcars, lettered the Soul Leather line from the tanneries. And I remember as a kid even seeing them in Bound Brook, New Jersey, and I was always fascinated by a wooden boxcar, and they looked ancient, but they were being used in interchange service. There's the 1800 and the 1500 together.
Why are these F units built by EMD coming from General Electric?
Probably because General Electric did some work on them.
They were traded in by other railroads to GE.
Yeah. And then GE had them, and Wellsville, Addison and Galeton, which never had any kind of money for a new engine, had to buy used. So they bought them from GE. If you had looked at that roster page, and that's also online, that roster page, you can just go on the internet, type in Wellsville, Addison and Galeton diesel locomotive roster, and that page will come up. It'll tell you who traded them to GE, where they came from. So this is at the, I think this is our trip in 1972. And these shots here, that's at Ansonia. That's at the interchange with the New York Central, or then Penn Central. And that was the Falls Creek line, which is now all torn out. There's that Western Pacific B unit that was an organ donor. And there's a outside braced wooden boxcar down there. And you can see this thing was in various states of decay. Most of the summertime shots were, I think, 1972 or 1973. I'm sorry. Another fully lettered boxcar over on the right there. And there is one of their classic in-service outside braced wooden boxcars. So if you're modeling, that's an excellent shot of the lettering and the logos that they used. That one said
steel underframe or truss rods?
Oh, I think they were steel underframe. They had to be steel underframe because they were used in interchange service. I saw them on the Jersey Central in Bound Brook. So here's more. They had a crane. It looks a little worse for wear. It was the quintessential short line, you know, held together with duct tape and rubber bands and everything, but they still ran trains. And they had a couple of home road cars like this. I don't think that went out in interchange service, but it was used for moving railroad ties, and same thing with that. Definitely work equipment. And they had a couple of snow plows. I'm glad I took all these roster shots. I was always one that liked to take action shots more than roster shots, but I'm glad that I did take these And I think these were on a visit on a weekend when there was nothing running. Otherwise, I would have been off chasing trains all day, but gave me a chance to go to the engine terminal, take pictures of things that were parked. And of course, there was nobody there to throw you out or give you a hard time. So you could wander around. Today, I would have brought my loppers with me and gotten rid of all the weeds. So they had these wooden cabooses, which they replaced with those shorty steel cabooses that they actually ran in service with. I think they had 2 of them. And here's C-103. So this is at Galeton. There's another shot at Galeton. It's C-104, so that's the other caboose that they were using.
Interesting trucks on that.
Yeah, it was different than the other wooden cabooses. So anyway, allegedly, the mainline speed limit was 30 miles an hour, and that was kind of a stretch. I think most of the time they were doing more like 20 or 25 at the most. So here's some maps. I'm always a big map fan. Even with Railpace Magazine, I always try to include a map with an article. So this is at Galeton. You can see they had an unusual thing there called a balloon track. So a train coming from Addison, from Ansonia over on the right-hand side, if he wanted to continue his trip and go up north, he could go around that balloon track. And it was also good for turning engines. Now here's their more modern, newer engine house that they built after the wood frame one they had burned down. And they were putting a tonner in the building there. And there's their freight house. I don't know what that thing on the right is. Looks like some kind of a circus car or something, but it was a piece of rail equipment. And there's an even older wooden caboose on the right. This is their headquarters, an office building. And they were friendly. They didn't chase you off the property. It was a short line. Most short lines didn't do that. So these were taken in 1972 on a Friday. I think it was in March. And it was a train that was going to go up to Wellsville, which was the more scenic and longer line. So that's the one you always wanted to get. So here we are back in Galeton again. You can see that balloon track right in the center of the picture, the loop. There was a big lumber yard. Here he is on the balloon track. There was actually a diamond there. He actually crossed the other track on a diamond, and he ran behind the station on the right-hand side. Now, right behind the engine was their freight yard. And you can see some old wooden boxcars over there on the left-hand side. They served a big lumber yard at Galeton, so that was more business that they handled. And here's a train getting ready to leave town, the 2 A units. Notice the different types of grills on the F units, the air grills at the top. So they're going to run from milepost 36.9 up to Wellsville. So it's about a 37-mile trip. So here we are leaving town. And I'm glad that I included a lot of the scenery in the picture, including the track car on the left and the old automobiles on the right. Too many rail fans just take real tight roster shots of the power and don't include any of the scenery. And then at the end of the day, they've got about 20 shots that all look the same, and you can't tell where they were taken. It's good to include some kind of location prop in your shot. Now here we are heading north in the summer out of Galeton. You can tell it's summer because they had the front nose door open, which is kind of awful for a rail fan, but you take a side view like that, and isn't a problem. Notice one engine was lettered and the other one wasn't lettered at this time. So if you're a model railroader, you can have an engine that isn't lettered and be prototype correct. Now here it is with both of them lettered on a different, these are different trips. This is the one in March of 72. So it was fairly easy to chase because A, they didn't go that fast, and B, the road pretty much followed the railroad the whole way. There were some places that were a little inaccessible, but generally it was an easy chase. And this is heading north in March of 72, going up the valley toward Ulysses, where there was a big horseshoe curve. He had a nice little train. At least it wasn't just light power or just one car. And that car, that red car there, they were chasing too. So there was actually somebody else on the road with me that day. Notice that Rock Island boxcar on the left, the double door boxcar. Ran through a beautiful country, absolutely beautiful country. And it was like shooting fish in a barrel. You got a shot like this, you drove up the road about a quarter of a mile and took another shot, and drove up the road another quarter mile. It was just wonderful. And it was in an area of Pennsylvania that you don't normally get to go through. It's not near Route 80. It's not near the New York State Thruway. It's just in the middle of nowhere. It's sort of like the East Broad Top Railroad. It's a destination. You have to just want to go there. So these are different trips on different days, but we're proceeding pretty much in geographical order up the line. There's a trip with the unlettered 2300.
What's happened to the right of way today?
Oh, it's all abandoned. All the track is all ripped out. It's all gone. Well, with the fact that the tanneries on the east end went out of business, there really wasn't much business left to serve. There's a carload of lumber there, so there must have been a set off somewhere for that, or it was interchange between the Penn Central and Erie Lackawanna, but I don't think there was much of that because Penn Central could interchange with Erie Lackawanna in about a dozen places. So anyway, we're moving north at Brookland, which is near Ulysses. There was a horseshoe curve. You can see it right where it says horseshoe curve. And that was kind of fascinating. And then the train worked itself up a huge grade up to Cutler Summit, also known as Newfield Junction. And at one time, the Coudersport and Port Allegheny connected with the WAG there, a short line connecting with a short line. Now, this is a train that had just come down the hill on the return to Galeton. You can see all the brake shoe smoke in the back. Here back in March, this was before the advent of handheld chainsaws and loppers, or we would have cleaned this area out completely. But I'm still glad I took the shot. You see, it was a dirt road crossing. This is climbing the grade up toward Cutler Summit. And yeah, he did get up there. This is taken from the highway, so you can see he's up quite a ways there in elevation. Here's a shot of a guy. Let me see. This is becoming downhill at Ulysses there, or Brooklyn. And that's up at Cutler Summit. There's the old, you can see that the office there was painted in Salzburg's colors, the cream and orange. And there's a train coming back with a flat car on the end. That's an interesting combination. Okay, after they came down from Cutler Summit, at Newfield, there was a team track, and they usually stopped there and dropped off cars. So I have a sequence of that coming up here. And there's the train up on the hill there. He had a horseshoe curve right about where that left-hand telephone pole is. There was a horseshoe curve, and then he came down across the road here. So it was definitely backwoods railroading. So here we had a outside braced wooden boxcar that was sitting on the team track. The track you see over on the left there, that's the main line. And here he comes. They didn't have any gates or flashers or bells or anything. They just had crossbucks, and you just blew the horn, and they didn't seem to crash into things. So apparently the local farmers here must have used this team track for fertilizer and animal feed. So here we are, they cut off from their train, and they're going to pick up that outside braced wooden boxcar, and then they're going to put another, I think they put that Burlington Northern car in the siding. And here they go. Yeah, this is after they did that. So they dropped off the BN car. And you can see how many crewmen they had. And at least 3 people on the ground there, plus the engineer in the cab. And then he's got to shove that back into his train. And here he put a CNR boxcar in there, in addition to the Burlington Northern car. That's a shot of him getting ready to leave town now. And he's picked up that outside braced wooden boxcar. This is a shot coming south toward Galeton from Wellsville, New York. And there's still a wooden boxcar in that siding. I'm not sure what that building was next to the track there, whether that was a freight house at one time or some kind of a rail-related structure. Unfortunately, railroading has lost a lot of its charm. A lot of the trackside props that were around, crossbucks and signals and buildings and freight houses and high switch stands, a lot of that stuff has just vanished, which is sad.
And coal docks and water towers.
Yeah, well, yeah, that went in the steam era. But I'm saying even stuff in the 60s and 70s from the diesel era has vanished. Railroading has become mostly sanitized. And now with PTC, they're even getting rid of signals. So, and here's a place called Pusher Siding. which was in the steam days for trains going south from Wellsville toward Galeton. They actually had to use pushers to get up the hill. And the siding is still there, and they used it to run around a boxcar here. You saw a shot earlier in the show of a CNR boxcar in that siding down there. And this is where they did that. And then they shoved this on the nose of the train. It's off to the right in this shot, and shoved it into that siding because it was a facing point switch at this point for a southbound train. So they were pretty creative with that kind of stuff. Yeah, there's the boxcar over on the right. So it was only about a mile or so that they had to make this move. So they didn't push the boxcar for many miles. Because obviously when you're taking pictures and chasing trains, the worst thing would be to have a train coming along with a boxcar on the nose and you're trying to take a grade crossing shot. So, well, you could say it was mid-train power. And this was a funny thing too. There were two grade crossings here. There was a whole bunch of rail fans chasing by this time. This is a southbound train. And there was a crossing back there where you can see that car. And there was a crossing right at my right, but you couldn't beat the train from one to the other. Those guys tried, but they didn't make it. And this is near Genesee, Pennsylvania, not New York. And a very scenic area with the dirt roads and little crossings and train back in the woods. No power lines, no high tension wires, just railroading in nature. So this is a southbound train, but we're working our way north geographically. Now this one's a little out of sequence. I don't know why I have this one in here at this point, but that's that boxcar that you saw that was on the nose of the train earlier. And he had shoved it into the siding here. He had dropped that Burlington Northern car off on the northbound run. Now we're up at Genesee and still has a station sign. Look, station looks a little worse for wear. Track looks a little worse for wear. And here comes a train. Now there was a branch here. This was all part of the original Buffalo and Susquehanna Railroad. And this was a branch line that went off to the right. But they were storing old boxcars on it at the time. And this shot is taken from the highway. There's the same shot a year later when the boxcars were gone. They must have scrapped them. And we have a little bit more greenery in the shot. But there's 3 wooden boxcars in that train. Here's the southbound coming by the Genesee station. You almost can't see the track, but it was there. Surprisingly, they didn't have a lot of derailments, although they did have one notable one, and there's a funny story behind that too. One of the trips, that's a southbound going by Genesee. One of the trips, Bob Bars and I were chasing the train, and we made the fatal railfan mistake of driving the highway, say the highway's over on the right-hand side, driving over the track at a private crossing and parking, rather than just leaving the car on the highway. You know, we didn't want to have to walk 50 feet. So we ran across the track and turned around and wanted to get a shot there. The train came along and it derailed right in front of us on the crossing. So we were trapped. We couldn't get our car out. Of course, they weren't going anywhere either. So we all just sat there for like 2 hours until a block and tackle track crew came up from Galeton and rerailed the car. It was only a minor derailment. I mean, the thing didn't flip over. They didn't need a crane. And they could kind of like tug it back and get it back on the track, but it was kind of embarrassing. And we were stuck. If we had parked on the road, we could have said, we're going to go get lunch. We'll see you guys later. And this is right up near Wellsville, rather, Wellsville, New York. Wellsboro is in Pennsylvania. That was on a different railroad. So this is what it looked like in Wellsville. You can see where the track is highlighted in yellow. That's WAG. The other track is Erie Lackawanna, which is now the Western New York and Pennsylvania, but doesn't run. It's just out of service, one step away from the grave. But there was an interchange there with Erie Lackawanna, so they actually dropped off cars and picked up cars there. That was the old Wellsville station. Still had the sign on it. There was an oil refinery here, and that closed in the 1950s, I guess. And that's the high school in the background there. And when the refinery closed, they lost a lot of business on that. It wasn't a very large refinery. It was actually kind of small, but it did ship by rail. So in Wellsville, there was a Y, so they could turn engines here. And they went across a bridge to the Erie Lackawanna connection on the other side of town. And they must have had a derailment and dragged something because they knocked the railing on the bridge over at a crazy angle. They also had a customer over here, which they serviced, like an agway. Yeah, it is an agway. There's a sign over on the right. And the track over on the left would have been cars set out for the Erie Lackawanna. So this is what it looks like close up. That blue in there is the river where you had that bridge. There's your Y track. And there's your connection with the Erie Lackawanna. And then the cross-hatched building there is your agway. That's from a topo map. The bridge, that black bridge in the background, is the Erie Lackawanna line. The EL had two lines west of Hornell. The freight line went up to River Junction and then swung south and came back to join this line here at Cuba, New York. And this line here was essentially what they called their passenger line. It had more grades on it, but it was suitable for passenger trains. The other line was river grade, and that's where they ran their through freights. So there's the bridge. I guess before they knocked the handrails over or after they fixed them, one or the other. So now we're going to move over to the other part of the railroad. At Ansonia is where they connected with New York Central or Penn Central. And then at Gaines Junction is where that line that went to Ansonia connected with what they would call the main line that went up to Elkland. And in both these cases, Galeton is to the left on these maps. So from Gaines Junction, you had the line to Ansonia, and then you also had the line that went through to Galeton, and in the other direction to Elkland, in the northeast direction. And that's Ansonia, which was there at that time, the Penn Central interchange. It was a great little railroad. I mean, they spelled their name out on the side, and they had a herald on the front, and they had wings. So they had a little bit of class, as opposed to some short lines that just either have a dip job engine with no lettering and no logos, or worse yet, it's a lease engine and it just says GATX or HLCX. So you don't even know what railroad it is. They have no personality at all. But this one definitely had everything lettered, and they had pride. Now, the track that I'm standing on there is the New York Central, Penn Central, Fallbrook line, which went from Corning, New York, down to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, Newberry Yard. And that was torn out in the Conrail era. It went through the Grand Canyon of Pennsylvania. So you look there, Milwaukee Road boxcar, that's gone. Illinois Central, that's gone. Union Pacific's still around. It's one railroad that's still around. And that's crossing US Route 6 at Ansonia. And there was a couple of intermediate grade crossings between Ansonia and Galeton. So it was kind of tight. It was mostly a tree tunnel, but there was a couple of places where you could get an open shot. Like that. And then it was back into the woods. That's a nice house. Imagine sitting there in your living room looking at that.
Did they buy F7s instead of hood units because they were so much cheaper?
I would kind of suspect that would be the reason why that, is one of a shoestring operation. You don't have a lot of money. It's like you need a car and you'd like to buy a Hummer or a Subaru Forester, but you've only got like $900. It's like, what can I get? It certainly wouldn't be easier for switching in an F unit. A hood unit would be easier. And if you were running one unit like they're doing here, you're going to have to run one direction ass backwards, which is not conducive to engineer operation. So I would presume it was just a financial thing, that GE had some engines that were traded in, and they needed engines because the center cab GEs they had were falling apart. So GE made them a deal they couldn't refuse. I don't think it was because of rail fans, a railfan CMO or anything that wanted an F unit. So now at one time in 1956, they went all the way to Addison, New York, which is on the Erie Railroad main line. But as you can see, during the 60s and 70s, they only went as far as Elkland, which was a large tannery. So here, we're in the Westfield area. The track headed due north and then made a right-hand turn, a 90-degree right-hand turn on the way over to Elkland. It also paralleled a New York Central branch. It says Penn Central on the map, but it was ex-New York Central. And it was definitely a light traffic area, or what Conrail would call an LDL, low density line. The New York Central branch, I think, ended a few miles to the west. According to the map, it shows it ending right there at that time. So here's Westfield Station. Still had a train order board. The track's over on the right. And I don't know when the agencies at these stations closed, but I would assume it must have been back in the 1960s sometime. They still had baggage wagons there, which had probably been sitting there for like 70 years. So anyway, As it turned to the east through Cowanesque and Knoxville, the WAG actually crossed over the New York Central, and then over on the right-hand side of this map, it went to Elkland, where the tannery was. And there's Elkland, the big black area up there with the tannery. It was actually served by both the WAG and the Penn Central, but WAG had most of the service into the tannery. And then it burned down, and that was the end of it. As you can see there, where there was a connection from both Penn Central and WAG, and the purple color highlighting on the track is the track that was abandoned up to Addison, New York. They didn't go any farther than Elkland in the 70s. And there's the Elkland station. It's amazing that all these stations stood, that they didn't burn them down or tear them down to save tax money. Yeah, you can still see one of those center cabs up at the Lakeshore Railroad Historical Society in northeast Pennsylvania. That's near Erie, Pennsylvania, east of Erie. So there is a bunch of WAG equipment stored. This is a Don Gilson shot, which is after the railroad shut down, the F units were sent to GE and in Hornell, New York, because GE had a facility in Hornell, which is now Alstom, where they're still trying to build an Acela and get it to work. So these are Don Gilson shots. In fact, you can see an Alco in the background there, or a U-boat, ex-Seaboard Coastline. I think we saw this shot before, but it basically tells you that the 1700 was preserved. I should get a picture of that at the museum and throw that in here. And that'll do. That's it.
All right.
Thank you,
Good
Tom.
night.
That was very good.